Hi everyone, welcome to the Quantum Bridge. We're back again with another new guest in the form of Will. Welcome to the show, Will.
Thank you very much.
Now, I'm going to pass this over to Casper, and he's going to get the show on the road. And that is a pun as well as Will. These have something to do with what we're going to be talking about today. So over to you, Casper.
Thank you very much, Gary. We'll leave that at that. And a very nice segue into the conversation with Will. So we have today with us Will Holman, Holman, I believe. And Will's somebody I've known now for, well, far too long, certainly from his perspective, no doubt. So a while. And somebody who I've always liked, not least because he's been able to live the sort of life that most of us hope for, I think, which is a life where actually the job you do is something you both created and enjoyed. I'll let Will actually go into that a little bit more rather than talking about any of those areas around that. So for now, welcome, Will, and maybe you can do a quick intro of yourself and touch on, if you wouldn't mind, the genesis of your publishing venture, and we can start to drill into how that came into being and what that was and why it is so sadly missed.
Well, thanks. I don't know how sadly missed it is, but it is by me, actually. Yeah, you're right.
And by me.
I did something I enjoyed. I mean, but yeah, I was working at a big publishing company called EMAP, it's now known as Bauer. And I was editing a magazine called Practical Classics, which is sadly now defunct. It's not true, I'm joking, but it should be. Its glory days are over, put it that way.
You wicked man.
Yeah, and a rival publishing house, we got wind of the fact they were launching a magazine called Retro Cars, which was basically a magazine about people who like to take something like an old Ford Cortina and put a modern sort of Mondeo engine in it and make it go a lot better than it ever did back in the day, that kind of thing. And these sort of became known as resto mods, if you like. That's what they seem to be known as these days. Anyway, I spoke to my boss and I said, you know, that we can put out something to rival this if you want to. And he allowed us to, and we did a little magazine which we gave away free with Practical Classics, which was called RPM. And it went down an absolute storm with the readers. They loved it. And I wanted to go ahead and, you know, I wanted EMAP to launch it, and lots of people did, including the managing director at the time, funnily enough. But my immediate boss and I didn't get on. He didn't like me, and I didn't like him. In fact, I still don't. He's not a very nice man, and he's not very good at his job. So he basically blocked the whole idea. And I'd been having a chat with a colleague and friend of mine, Kevin Leeper, who worked on the magazine with me, and we'd sort of toyed with the idea of leaving EMAP and launching a magazine like RPM ourselves. But we worked out that we'd need about 150,000 quid, and there are about 150,000 reasons we couldn't do that. So we sort of canned the idea and just got on with life. And then one of the advertising guys at EMAP who worked on Practical Classics approached us and said, you know, why don't you try and launch that magazine independently? And we said, well, we thought about it, but we can't afford to. We haven't got the money, we haven't got the finance. He immediately then went to my boss and snitched on us, basically, and said that that's what we've been planning to do. And we got sort of marched out the building at dawn, you know, with all our computers gone and all our contacts books missing. And so we were basically unemployed at that point, and thought, well, we'll have to try and do this magazine because what else can we do, you know? So we got a 25,000 quid overdraft from the bank, and somehow we got it up and running. And that's how it came about, really. It was more by accident.
Will, when was that? Was that sort of about 2000? Well, I can't remember exactly.
2000 and... Oh, I could tell you if I look up on the shelf, but I think it was 2004. 2004.
Okay, yeah. So just before times became particularly tough in around 2008 for
Well,
fledgling businesses. So anyway, sorry, yeah.
yes, exactly. I mean, it's funny you say that, because obviously only having 25 grand, and that was an overdraft to start it, made things very difficult for us. And it took us a long time to get financially on our feet, which we'd managed to do just about the time that the international banking crisis hit. And then the iPad was launched at the same time, which was a double whammy, because obviously
Start
it's
to go digital, I suppose. Yeah.
yeah, well,
And for the
yeah, we did
youngsters,
go
this is
digital, Gary, but we had a digital issue for years, but nobody bought it. Well, aside from a few people in Australia and Singapore for whom the postage of a subscription copy was prohibitive, most people just preferred the paper copy.
So I think we better just jump back, just for people's reference, just to make sure that the fact that I know Practical Performance Car was a magazine. It's a full color magazine. It featured cars that were both mainly readers' cars and cars that were fairly heavily modified, but were accessible, i.e. they weren't ridiculously expensive. So I just better frame a bit of this as we start to talk about the genesis of the company. Just for those people who are completely unaware of this, we'll try and put an image on the screen of one of the copies of the early copies of the magazine for people's reference too. But just because I do this massive thing of assuming everybody knows everything that I happen to know about our guests, I just thought I'd better frame that with, that's how it started, Will. It was always Practical Performance Car. Is that right?
Yeah, funny enough, we were going to call it BHP, but the sort of 11th hour, we discovered that EMAP owned the copyright to that name, even though they never used it on a magazine. So we quickly had to change it. And we figured that as we'd worked on something called Practical Classics, we'd include practical in the title because it might help. I don't know whether it ever did. And everyone used to say, well, what's practical about a performance car? And of course, there isn't much really, but the practical element was basically the sort of hands-on. The fact the magazine featured people with spanners in their hands, fiddling with things and making things and modifying things. That was what it was supposed to convey.
And Will, just quickly on that, I'd like to come back to getting it out and all those things around distribution and the other headaches that you had to overcome, which are just great lessons for anybody going into business on their own or as a partnership with a friend or whatever. But in terms of the magazine, did it immediately have that? Did it strike that nerve with people who were out there, as the internet now does? Of course, you've got tons of car channels out there, a lot of people fiddling with their own cars, doing stuff, just filming it, and putting a lot of time and effort into that and getting some real engagement and immediate resonance, as you can do in sort of real time with the internet. But rolling it back to a time when the internet was at least less prevalent, was there this immediate sort of sense of a Practical Performance Car family, or is that something that really took quite a while to grow over time?
I think it happened quite quickly, really. There were a lot of people doing this kind of thing to cars, fiddling with them, and there wasn't any real forum for them or any. The magazine always had a quite clubby feel. I mean, it wasn't a club, but it kind of felt like if you were a reader, you were in. You were part of the club. And I had, I used to get emails from readers. I had emails from readers, over a period of nearly 20 years from the same people, who read it all that time. And they were great people. Our readers were always really nice people, which was lovely, because some of the readers on previous mags I've worked on could be, not that great sometimes, but almost to a man. And they were mostly men, I have to admit. Our readers were really nice people. We'd go to shows and to promote the magazine, car shows, auto sport and classic car shows and things like that. And we'd meet loads of these people. They were just great guys, really nice guys.
And you had those sort of cars in the park type meetups as well, didn't you? With just really weird. The great thing I thought about the mag, and therefore the readership and the content and so on, was the fact that this is another salient point I should mention, is that Practical Performance Car wasn't under a single manufacturer. So other than, you've got all these other things. I don't know if they emerged later, Will. You can tell me, I'm not up on this enough, but like Retro Ford and all of these other ones, then you've got all the VW tuning things. I'm going to miss out a whole range of them, but certainly VW and Ford were very strong camps in the UK, and I'm sure that that's equally true in Europe and the States as well. But the other great thing about Practical Performance Car is it did feature people who had all sorts of different cars. You know, they might have a Vauxhall and a Ford and something else. They might have a day-to-day runner and then a couple of cars that they're working on, or one car that they're working on with a friend, or whatever it may be. So it was, in that way, it was very inclusive. And then at the undercurrent of your humour coming through it, and even the other writers, you know, there was that sense of they were pretty irreverent, and you're sort of on the inside and an inside joke. So there were a lot of reasons why it brought people together rather than having these manufactured divisions. So do you think that was a strength of the magazine from the beginning, that it wasn't a single manufacturer magazine?
I think it was a strength in some respects, and it certainly made it more interesting as far as I was concerned, and hopefully the readers as well, obviously, because that's the whole point. But
yeah.
It made the selling advertising much more difficult. I mean, if you're selling advertising on for instance, classic Ford magazine, it's fairly obvious which companies you're going to go after and why they should advertise in your magazine. But it was always a bit more difficult for us because we did feature everything from Bentleys to Escorts, and you know, so
27-litre Rovers.
Yeah, that was well, that's not many magazines have 27-litre Rover SD1s in them, but we have one every month. One of our contributors, Charlie Broomfield, he's still building it now. I spoke to him yesterday about it. He's just made his own supercharger for it because obviously 27 litres on its own is not enough. Well, he wants to do 200 miles an hour, you see, and last time he tried it, he only got to 187. So apparently those last 13 miles an hour need a lot more power.
Has he tried tweaking the aerodynamics?
He has, yeah. He's made his own aero pack for it. But he's not, unfortunately, although he has built his own engine dynamometer, he hasn't yet built his own wind tunnel. So how effective his aero pack is, I don't know.
I'm wondering there, Will. Right. You know, you mentioned the advertising there. In terms of the magazine, you know, how much is the revenue coming from advertising and the cover price of the magazine itself? You know, I'm guessing you couldn't survive on just the selling it to customers. You need that. No,
it was basically pretty much a 50-50 split, Gary. Perfect. It was 50% copy sales and 50% ad revenue. But of course, that changed over the years because from sort of around 2008-9 onwards, advertising became harder and harder to sell because everyone wanted to try this new fancy internet thing. And it just became harder. It just meant we had to cut our budgets and we couldn't do the kind of things that we used to go on big long trips, and we'd go to the Nürburgring. We went to the Nürburgring in Germany in Charlie's 27-litre Rover SD1, and we went to Germany and bought an ex fire service transit van, and things like that. And it meant we couldn't do things like that anymore because we used to sort of do things that were kind of like Top Gear on a budget kind of trips. Very much of a budget compared with Top Gears, but they still had that fun element to them, a bit daft. But we, as the years went on and the ad revenue came down, we could no longer afford to do things like that, unfortunately. So,
Will, just to say, on a business perspective from this, because you're touching on finances limiting certain things, but that made you all inventive, and it also, the readers are an inventive bunch as well, because again, most of them are working to a budget, and most of them are tinkering around and exchanging ideas and maybe parts and visiting shows and whatever. But in terms of the business aspect of this actually supporting you at the time, I mean, let's put it in some context. Did you have a family? Did you need to be paying a mortgage? Was it able to start doing that fairly quickly? We all talk about things in hindsight with, well, I managed to do that and I made it through 20 years and it did sort of pay the bills and whatever. But those first few years, how were you surviving? Did it immediately give you any revenue, or was that something you had to wait for?
It had to, because we both had families and mortgages. So that's me and Kevin, my business partner. So we had to make money out of it as soon as we could. In fact, some of the best ad revenue we ever had was on some of the earliest issues, because we had a very good ad salesperson, but she got poached and went somewhere else. So, which, as is the way. I'm sorry, you can probably hear my dog in the background howling. I can only apologise. My wife's gone out and he thinks the house is empty. So, if you want to stop and I'll go and try and calm him down, we can, but it's up to you.
No, it's fine, unless you think that he's in a real state, in which case
no, he's just being a dog.
Okay.
But yeah, what was I talking about? The ad revenue, and that, yeah, we had to make a living out of it from the off. That we just didn't have any choice. So when we started, basically we produced almost the entire magazine between us. We didn't hire any other writers. We just did everything ourselves in order to try and get a wage out of it. And that's how we did it. And then as it got on its feet, we were able to sort of step back a bit and allow other people to help us put it together.
So, you know, we're all used to in new businesses of where people are all hands to the pump, I suppose is a phrase, you know, where you have to muck in and do what's necessary. Were there any times in that first year or two, and you can tell me what the timeline was before it felt a little more comfortable, Will, but were there any times when you actually thought this is going to fall away? You know, this isn't going to happen. We're not going to pull this off. Or was that a perennial thought for you?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, it was a worry. I can remember lying awake at night having pains in the chest one time. I thought, this really isn't good, because I was so worried about how I was going to pay them. I mean, I'd separated from the mother of my kids, and she was she needed maintenance paid. We argued quite a lot about the amount, and she wanted a lot more than I could actually afford. But yeah, I was under a lot of financial pressure, so it was pretty difficult. But by around 2008, it had stabilized, and we could see that we were going to be able to make a pretty good living out of it, which is what we wanted. And then of course the banking crisis hit and the iPad came out, and I thought, when the iPad came out, I thought, well, who's going to buy an oversized mobile phone that you can't ring anyone on? And I remember I had a parcel delivered from my neighbour, my elderly neighbour. So in the evening, I knocked on his door and took it round for him, and he came to the door holding a bloody iPad. And I thought, God, he's 80, this guy. I thought, well, if he's bought one, then everyone's going to buy one. And I think I am still the only person I know who doesn't own an iPad. So yeah, that really put the mockers on. Well, didn't put the mockers on it, but it certainly was the beginning of the end of the glory days of magazines. And they've gone downhill pretty quickly. I mean, last month, Land Rover Owner magazine closed. And when I was at EMAT, that was an EMAT publication. When I was at EMAT, I might have remembered this wrong, but I think I'm right in saying that was second only to Max Power magazine. Remember that?
Yep.
In the profit stakes, it made them a fortune, Land Rover Owner, and they closed it last month. So, you know, the fact that we survived until August last year is pretty cool, really.
Yeah, it's amazing, actually. And did that thing of having to, you'd always have to cut your cloth accordingly, but did that thing of limiting the stuff you wanted to do, how painful and how protracted was that? Was that from 2008 onwards, and it never really meant that you could do those more fun things outside of putting together the mag itself? Or were there sort of times where you had a slight peak again and you could get out there and do more interesting stuff?
Well, we did a show at Mallory 3 years running called PPC in the Park.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of work, but it made us a few quid. So that helped subsidize things. And that made
it was a great event, by the way. I went to that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we enjoyed it. Unfortunately, the ownership of Mallory changed, and the new owners didn't want to work with us, so we had to stop doing it. And then we tried to do it at another place, Rockingham Raceway in Northamptonshire, and of course that's closed now as well. But yeah, they mucked us around for so long that by the time they told us we couldn't do it, it was too late to find anywhere else. So the event died, unfortunately. But yeah, that helped us. So yeah, there were times when we still could do things. It was around 2016 really when things became really difficult, and we bought a business premises, which was basically a huge workshop with a tiny office attached to it. So we produced the mag from the tiny office and filled the workshop full of old cars. But it got to the point in 2016 when we realized we couldn't afford it anymore. So we decided to work from home, and we rented the office out, which was, you know, the right thing to do financially. But it did ruin the fun a bit. It meant that you know, the creative spark that you had when you've got several people in an office all having ideas together went, and I ended up basically producing the magazine on my own from that point onwards, just sat in this little room here, which, you know, was very cost effective, but I don't think the magazine was as good as it was prior to that. It couldn't be really, because, you know, when you fire ideas off other people, you can end up in some fun places and come up with some good ideas to put in the magazine as a result. But when you
Had
just
you
sat
been
around,
going out and seeing a lot of the readers and the people who are going to their cars would be and them might be featured in the magazines before? Because I know ultimately it became the case, if I'm right, that people were actually pretty much writing their own blurb around their cars, and then it was coming to you ultimately pretty much to be re-edited and worked into the mag. So what was the dynamic? How did actually the magazine work in the editorial side of things for most of that time, Will?
well, we had to rely on the readers for the cars most of the time, because the whole point of the magazine was that the cars were unique.
Yeah.
And we were lucky. We had readers would be getting in touch constantly saying, I've got this, I've built this, I've built a Triumph Toledo with a Harrier jet engine in it. Do you want to come take some pictures of it? Things like that. And actually, we
But
did
of
have
course, you all had your own cars as well, right? Because there was a monthly thing about sort of how you were all getting on with the cars in whatever state of disrepair or repair they were in their garage as well. So that was a nice thing that you had you guys doing the same thing as the readers were doing, and that those things are sort of overlapping.
Well, yeah, that was kind of the sort of spirit of the mag, really. We had the staff car section in which we would be, breaking things every month and trying to fix them, and trying to fit stupid engines in old cars and all sorts of things. So basically, we were doing what the readers were doing, and that was the point. It wasn't like sort of Evo magazine where the reader's sitting there on the hard shoulder in his Vauxhall Insignia reading about some bloke driving a Ferrari Enzo around the Nürburgring. We were basically doing the same thing as our readers, and that was part of the appeal, really, and hence the high club.
Will, don't you think that lent itself? Because I know that, as you've now touched on, we've both alluded to it, the fact that the magazine is no more. But that model is very similar to the model of many people out there now on the internet, whether in the UK or elsewhere, and it can be obviously anywhere now, doing things and then maybe engaging with their audience as well on some level, maybe with live chats and whatever. And actually, in a way, the mag, Practical Performance Car, was very much a precursor to what we see so prolifically now on the net. Was there ever a sense at that time when the magazine was, and you can maybe touch on that in the last few minutes we have now, of that sort of winding down and you being reborn in your new guys? But was there ever a time there when you did consider, or was there a lot of pressure from readers as well, who very much got this love affair with the mag, to actually try to continue that in a more digital format, like using YouTube and other platforms?
Yeah, I don't remember there being any pressure when the magazine was still going, but certainly when we announced that last year that the August issue would be the last one, a lot of people got in touch and said, well, can't you, put it online? The trouble is, it's really hard to monetize that, and I don't have time to be doing something. I mean, I can't, or rather, I can't afford to be doing something that isn't making me a living. I have to make a living. And I had an idea 20 years ago that we would launch a magazine, build it up, and sell it as a business, and then I'd move to the Bahamas or something. But unfortunately, that didn't quite work out.
The Bahamas bit hasn't happened yet. Yeah.
No, I'm still in Northamptonshire, so which isn't bad. It could be worse, but but yeah, when the magazine died, people were saying, could you put it on YouTube? And I did think about it. But I'd worked out that in order to, I think YouTube channel has to be updated at least once a week, and you need, a good half an hour of material. And I'd worked out that the material I'd need would include Dave Walker in his Rolling Road workshop, which is in the darkest part of Norfolk and takes 2.5-3 hours to get to. And it would also need to include Charlie Broomfield, who's the chap who has the 27-litre Rolls-Royce Meteor engine in a Rover SD1. And he's a good way away from me as well. So I'd figured it would be like, 4 or 5 hours driving every week before I'd even filmed anything. And then I'd have to get home and edit it and put it all together. And I just wasn't feeling it. And also, to be honest, it's not really my thing. I like putting magazines together. I like writing. Sorry, I've got someone knocking on the door very persistently.
Well, listen, let's call it a day then, Will, because I think that was a great overview of what the mag was, your early involvement, and where the genesis of it, and what's happened today. And we can always come back and do a part 2 sometime. So
yeah, sure.
I think, given your dog is unwell, you have someone at the door, and the universe is obviously screaming at us to wrap this one up. Thank you very much, Will.
Well, thanks for having me. I'd like to speak to you again.
Welcome.
Yeah, love to. All right.
Cheers.
Cheers. Have a good rest of your day if you can.
Thanks. Bye.
Oh, yeah.